I'm going to put a question before you, and this is especially true of the sisters. I'm going to ask you, how the dickens did you come up with that terrible translation of this Greek word? I'm sorry, it's like C, not. Or, as we write it in English, what is that word? Huh? Orthodox. What does it mean? No. Absolutely no. 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 And this is one of the biggest of our problems. Let me.
Does it mean right teaching?
We'll get to it. No, it doesn't. Absolutely wrong. But we'll get to it. What does it mean?
Different.
Wait. No, it doesn't mean different. The answer is literally under your nose, but no one is looking at it. Look at this word. Does anyone know what the English word paradox is?
Compared to?
Let me give you, compared to, it's part of comparison, but it's equally compelling. Something equally compelling, a question with two sides equally compelling is paradoxical. The Greeks have a prayer. Voxa patri, ke agio pneumati, slava otiu I synovi Svjatomu Duhu. Tak? Tak. Pravoslavni ne je pravovirni. Tak? Aboni. That's right. The word is not true. Now, why am I carrying on like a madman? Why is this so bloody important to us? It does not mean truth. It does not mean faith. Ortho means right. What does pravo?
Would it be right direction?
Right belief.
No, not right belief. No. What is slava? Pravoslavni. Pravoslavna is the right glory. Not the right faith, not the right truth, nothing but the right glory. And does this make a difference? You bet your haluchi it does. Now, one of the reasons I say that Byzantine theology is dying among Byzantine Catholics is because we're tripping over our words. We're not even paying attention to what we're saying, are we? See, the danger is that another sect of Christians has adopted the word pravoslavni as their brand name, like Viz or Oxidol. And we're so busy we're tripping over our feet because we don't want to be like them. We're not those people. So that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. And until we get past the point of being afraid of it, we are doomed to lose our tradition. The truth will make you free. You don't have to worry about the truth. You really don't. All right, why again? I asked a minute ago this question, why am I carrying on like a madman in front of you? Because I do think this is critical. Doxa in Greek means glory. The church of true glory has to do with something alluring. Doxa in Greek does not mean glory in the sense of an Eastern potentate, a caliph or a sultan's entourage, elephants with spangles and dancing, It doesn't mean majesty. It does not mean majesty. It does not mean a panoply. It means something that entices. In the Old Testament, the glory of God was referred to by the Hebrew word Shekinah, the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud, other manifestations of God's glory. Now, here's where we get into it. St. John the Apostle, the theologian, quotes Jesus as saying, I gave them the glory that you and I had before the world was created, Father, so that they may be one. He did not say in that context, I gave them the true faith, I gave them the truth, or anything else. He said, I gave them the glory. So the question is, what is this glory? John the Apostle in the prologue to his gospel says, In the beginning was the Word was with God. And we saw his glory, the glory as of the only begotten Son. What was he talking about? He was talking about something that would later be called light. Light. We're going to come all the way around the mountain. Bear with me. We'll come all the way around the mountain. By the time we're finished tonight, if you understand nothing else, you'll understand this. Light. A certain kind of light. The Church of the Orthodox is the church of the true light. Now that brings with it the concept of truth, intellectual truth. But it's more than intellectual truth. Intellectual truth by itself, we will see, leads to stagnation and death. The sisters keep here, most especially tonight, the feast of Christ, the lover of mankind. It's a festival we borrowed from Western European Christianity, but it has something to say to us. It's a feast that talks about the love of Christ, or the Sacred Heart, which is the Western image of it. We must come to understand that for the Jew that gave us the original concept of glory as being the presence of God, Shekinah in Hebrew, the heart was the seat of the feeling intellect. So that if a Jew were to be exposed to the notion of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, a Jew would understand proper thinking with proper feeling together. To separate proper feeling from the mind to the Jew was preposterous. The Jews had an idea of feeling in the biological sense. I feel happy, I feel sad, I feel good, whatever. But the seat of feeling for the Jew, that kind of feeling, affection we might call it, or emotion, was in the kidneys, not the heart. See, the heart's a Western European symbol, and it's only a symbol in that sense. If you read the Psalms, you will hear the line, "You have tested my kidneys, my reins." Yes, we jump all over the place trying to translate it. What it means is, you've looked into what I like, O Lord. A Western European would say, you've examined my heart, because that's what, Valentine's Day and all that, that's our symbol. But to the Jew, the heart was the seat of knowledge that brought willpower, that brought volition. Glory to the Jew was the presence of God, and it had to be total. It had to be a feeling understanding. The mind, what we would call the mind and heart, working as one. This glory must be conveyed to us, and it is conveyed to us, and the purpose of our work tonight is to trace the giving of glory. I cannot repeat to you often enough the words of Jesus out of the Last Supper. I gave them your glory, that they may be one. If you master that phrase, if you come to understand that phrase, you know more already than this course can teach you. We push on. We now go to another 85-cent Greek word, a humdinger, one that was a favorite of Max the Confessor. The word is or, as we transliterate it, P-E-R-I-C-H-O-R-I-S-I-S. Perichorisis. What the dickens does perichorisis mean? It means a sharing of attributes, a sharing of energy. Now, we touched on this word in our sessions Tuesday night. Max the Confessor had to answer a terrible problem that had arisen just before his time. It was the problem of monothelitism, or the heresy that there is only one will in Jesus. Now, monothelitism isn't much of a problem to us today. I mean, most of us have never even heard of it. Because we don't deal with Christology that way. But at the time of Maximus, there were people saying Jesus had no human will. It was completely absorbed, so to speak, by the divine will. And Max, along with the Orthodox, you'll pardon the use of the word for true believers, as we've just seen, Max comes along and says, that's terrible. If, basing himself on what the Antiochian fathers said, that whatever is not assumed into the divinity, whatever does not become bonded to Jesus cannot be saved. If Jesus had no human will, then the human will cannot be saved. It remains perverse. It is impossible to save the will, and therefore it is impossible to save the human being. The emperor put a gag order out, and he said, I don't even want people to talk about this. Because Max broke the gag order, they ripped out his tongue and they cut off his right hand. And that's how he gets the name Maximus the Confessor, because he had to suffer for the faith. He died only about 5 weeks after this amputation because of the way it was carried out. He died from the infection and everything. But he literally gave his life to protect the doctrine of two wills. Here's how it works. Remember in Tuesday night's classes, I said one of the principles of the Byzantine church is that energy, or power, or whatever you want to call it, arises from ousia, not hypostasis. That is, it arises from the nature of the being, not from the concrete situation of the being. In other words, I am human because I have a human nature, not because I'm George who's standing in this room at this time with all my characteristics. Do you comprehend the difference here? It's critical. In other words, your ability to act as a human being depends on your nature. In the Western Church, this will become the basis of the natural law, not on your concrete situations. So that if your concrete situation gets crusty, and that's the word I used, it prevents your nature from operating. Remember me pointing that out on Tuesday? Good, thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Max said, the fact that the two natures of Christ can share the same energy proves A, there is no inherent contradiction between divinity and humanity. For example, there is an inherent contradiction between a square circle. You cannot have a square circle, right?
Right.
They're absolutely incompatible. You can have a yellow circle, right?
Yes.
Right. Now, human nature is not diametrically opposed to the divine nature. Some modern theologians, especially people like Bonhoeffer and the Lutheran school, have created terrible problems because they claim that God is the total other. And while there's a certain amount of truth in that, in the sense that God is transcendent, they carry it again off the deep end and in the wrong direction, and they claim that there is an impossible gap between humanity and divinity. But the Byzantines teach that humanity and divinity are compatible. They can be brought together. Not only are they brought together, but that's how humanity was first created. In the icona and the homoousin, the image and the likeness of God. Max comes along and he says, look, fellas, the divine nature of Jesus has a will and it operates. The human nature of Jesus has a will and it operates. And these two wills are synchronized. Remember the tuning fork thing on Tuesday, right? You can tap a tuning fork, and if the other one is of the same caliber, it will ring sympathetically. Max said they work together so that the action of one becomes the action of the other. Max points this out concretely. He says, the human Jesus, the human persona, or the human manifestation of Jesus, walks to the tomb of Lazarus. And I'm paraphrasing Max, but it's almost his example. Walks to the tomb of Lazarus. The human nature of Jesus speaks, Lazarus, come forth. But it is the divine nature of Jesus that makes Lazarus come forth. But the two, in this case, are working together, and they share. The divinity of Jesus uses the humanity of Jesus as the doxa, or the Shekinah, or the presence, the manifestation. In other words, divinity is made manifest in humanity. That's Max's very big contribution in my opinion. This doctrine then begins to gather momentum on its own. The glory is then shared and passed on. We're going to have to go down two different roads in the course of the evening. In one road, we will talk about the luminous darkness. That's one beautiful phrase that comes from Gregory Nyssa that Max will take up and use. The path of getting away from the crusts that blind us by their false light, the luminous darkness, and with the other road is, or the positive side, is the sacraments. The sacraments. Now, give me a half a minute here to see how I want to proceed with this. This doctrine of Max caused a furor. It wasn't Maximus' doctrine. About the time, or if you have your timesheets, with you, let's take a look at something let's look at the bottom half of the page. You see that Maximus dies in about 675, and then the Iconoclast controversy breaks out. Iconoclasm was an offshoot, so to speak, of this problem of the sharing of attributes. The Iconoclast said, we are not permitted to have images because images are idolatry, and we are forbidden to have idols. But underneath their theory was the nagging Arianism, the nagging doctrine that Jesus wasn't really human. That the Christ had not really assumed matter to himself and become, as we use the word, physical. But that it was a kind of phantasm, a kind of apparition. So the true believers said that's ridiculous. Now again, you notice the terrible importance that the Byzantine religious tradition put on things being real, the physical, the material, the flesh and blood. This is why we bless everything that isn't nailed down, for example. We'll come back to that later. We bless everything. And at the end of the prayer book, the priest, Slujebnik, there's a prayer. It says, if the thing to be blessed has no blessing of its own, use this one. You get everything in. The Iconoclasts were defeated by especially the work of two people, Theodore of Studion, and more especially the work of John of Damascus. There were two outbreaks of iconoclasm. And the fact of the matter is that there was a terrible social and economic part to this heresy. You see, the emperor wanted he wanted control of the church. The emperor wanted control of the church. And one way to get control of the church was to tighten the purse strings. By forbidding the making of images, he was able to cut off most of the income of the monasteries. Aha, catch it? Because it was by the making and the sale of devotional objects and icons that the churches could be financially independent. Then the tax contributions of, the emperor's donations and such would be the rest of the church's financial income. But by starving off the church, the emperor hoped to bring the church into complete compliance with imperial policy. So this heresy, as theoretical as it seems, was also extremely practical, in the very worst sense of the word. Nonetheless, the Empress Irene finally put the final kibosh on the whole thing, and you notice the Sunday of Orthodoxy instituted in 843, okay, that we keep that on the first Sunday of Lent every year, the restoration of the holy images. It is not simply that we got our holy pictures back. It also meant that the church became independent of the government, and the government and the theologians, the whole society, recognized by this that these objects, these icons, were filled with glory. That's why we call it the Sunday of Orthodoxy. The icons, the objects, what have you, like other things, become, through this perichoresis, this sharing of attributes, they become filled with glory. Jesus Christ is the glory of God the Father. He is, in his incarnation, the glory. This glory is then poured out on or poured into those who become Christ. All right? That's all of us. But that's not the end of the line. And if you remember what I said on Tuesday, this glory is poured out onto the whole world. Right? Right. Because in the Feast of the Transfiguration, besides the face of Christ turning white, remember what I pointed out on Tuesday, what else turned white? His clothes. Have you ever seen a real icon of Pentecost? I mean a real icon of Pentecost. Probably don't even know what I mean, do you?
No.
Probably. There are two icons of Pentecost, to tell you the truth, because there are two aspects to the festival. One is the Holy Trinity, usually shown as the famous Rublev icon of the three angels sitting at Abraham's table. The other is the picture of the cosmos. You will see the 12 apostles sitting around in council. Sometimes the Virgin Mary is shown, and she should be, she can be, I should say, that's part of the feast. But you will also see in a canonical icon of Pentecost a little man, usually sitting in what looks like a cave at the bottom of the picture, and he wears a crown, and he's holding what looks like the omophore of the Blessed Mother. Have you ever seen an icon like this?
Yes.
Okay. Who is that? No. No. The world. The cosmos. The world. That person represents the world. See, we could talk about icons for 6 weeks. I mean, iconography is a very complex science that does a lot of teaching, but we've lost the symbols. We can't read icons anymore. And because we can't read an icon anymore, we throw them out. They don't make any sense to us. It's like picking up something written in French, Spanish, Portuguese, or some other language that you don't speak. If you're lucky to get someone who can interpret it for you, it may become valuable. But if you can't understand it, you throw it out. And that's where our theology is going. Okay. So the glory is shared. Now, this perichoresis means that all things in their own order share the Spirit, the glory, call it what you want. All matter is being transfigured. All of matter, the whole cosmos. This opened up. This is the Orthodox or the Byzantine position. This all opened up a hornet's nest. You have, at this time, historically, the freezing of the Byzantine church. Some theologians have actually called it the death of the Byzantine church. From the period, roughly in the death of John of Damascus, from 749, you begin to have such a calcification, such a hardening of tradition and doctrine that that the Spirit is being squeezed out of it. It's like a sponge gone dry. You know, when a sponge is wet, it's soft, it's pliable, and you can use it to wash with and it's comfortable. But if you took a dry sponge and you rasped it on your skin, it would not be quite so pleasant. Well, this happened to the Byzantine church. We've had our bad periods too. From the death of John of Damascus, we begin to calcify, to harden. We become heavy with ceremony. We become heavy with commentary. We become heavy with scholasticism, the Byzantine scholasticism. It's ponderous. It's uninvigorating. This will be broken. This downward spiral is going to be broken in two ways. The missionary efforts of the Greek church, especially with Cyril and Methodius, because it's going to bring a whole fresh experience among the Slavs, while Constantinople, the mother church, is still on the way down. But the other area where it's going to have a fresh rebirth is around 949. You notice the birth of Simeon, the new theologian. Now, Simeon was what we would call a charismatic. Simeon departed mightily from the intellectual system. And he's like a Francis of Assisi in some ways. He just, he's all over the place, and it's just wonderful. And that's good. He brought a lot of fresh vitality. But Simeon did not have the intellectual machinery to hand over to people who wanted to know what the dickens this was all about. But divine providence would raise up such a man, but he would not be born until 1359. And that gives us a problem, because in 1054, what happened? The schism, right. The East and the West finally went their separate ways. So that the Western Church, by this time, by the time Gregory of Thessalonica, or Gregory Palamas, is born, the Western Church is in isolation from the Byzantine Church and vice versa. What's going on in the Western Church at the end of the 1100s, the 1200s, 1300s? What's going on in the Western Church besides Protestantism? We're getting ready for that. I mean, that's just beginning to stew. But what's happening? The Crusades, and what else is happening at this time? Something else is developing. They're sending missionaries too, yes?
Why they destroying the icons, burning them and all that?
No, I'm talking about the West now. They didn't have a problem with icons. The West didn't have that. You have the rise of the golden age of Western scholasticism. St. Dominic, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, these great thinkers. They are all coming up in the 1200s, the 1300s, right? That's the high age of scholasticism in the West. Now, they are thinkers. They are thinkers. But they are thinking according to the patterns they learned in an isolated Western church. Earlier in the evening, you heard me say that if each church kept its tradition and we were in communion and a dialogue with each other, we preserve the whole doctrine better. Here's an excellent example of how it fails. The Western thinkers were thinking. Along comes somebody who can explain the Eastern thinking, but they won't listen to him. Why? Because the Western Church has said the Eastern Church is heretical, and the Eastern Church turned around and returned the favor. Okay? Well, what is the problem? It has to do with this concept of glory and the sharing of attributes. Here is one of the critical differences between the Latin and the Greek churches. The Latin Church maintains that man cannot have a direct experience of God. This is the Latin doctrine. Man cannot have a direct experience of God. All that can happen is that God, who is on the other side of a barrier, can create an event that leads man to an awareness of God, but not an experience of God. Do you see the difference? It is as though you and I were locked in two different rooms, and you would perceive that there was probably someone there, and if we both knew Morse code, we might get a message across, but you would have no experience of me, would you? Right. On the other hand, the Eastern Church teaches and maintains, yes, a human being can and does and will have a direct experience of God. Absolutely. And it is this experience that will deify us. Now we will take a 7-minute break.
We're doing last night lecturing.
We received a brochure from and in there was a robe of justice. Have you ever heard of a robe?
Come to that question of immersion. In Eastern Catholic traditions, we sort of lost that tradition. Although I understand it's also another thing that might be brought back to the church. But the early practice was definitely by immersion, and even scripturally. Even the scriptures, the practice of immersion was commonplace, and it was the way that baptism was conducted.
Father, according to the Latin Rite, when the children are prepared for confirmation, they are told the reason why they're not confirmed until they're about 8 or 9 years old, so that they will understand why they are being confirmed. That's the reason for the devotion.
But that's not historically the reason. The historical reason was the Pelagianism, this controversy with Pelagius, who attacked the whole concept of original sin and the need of even baptism, the need of the Spirit of the Lord. That's a nice explanation for it. And it makes a lot of sense. There's a commitment to some of the dioceses are now having to give 30 hours of actual time of doing some kind of work, social work, parish work, ministerial work, with a real sense of commitment. Oh, that has the confession. We never had a connection with. No, that was a much later development that came from monastic, and probably private confessions. Everybody kind of sees that private confession. Originally, it was in the monasteries confession, and it probably was something that developed in Ireland with the Irish monks, and they sort of brought it into the church. In the non-Greek Byzantine Eastern churches, confession is not a strong concept at all. In the Armenian church, it's almost not even, it's listed as one of the 7 sacraments, but almost no one goes to confession. I mean, not out of disrespect or immorality or I'm talking about the Armenian Orthodox, Armenian Catholics, I'm sure because of their influence from Rome, Latin tradition. But even the historians, the Chaldeans, the Jacobites, confession was never a strong concept in the East. That was not a strong, even in Greece today, people don't go to confession. That is not a strong Eastern tradition, private confession. That developed in the West, became much later in the church, and is probably, most people say, maybe when I present, kind of sometimes presenting it today, maybe I can do some research on it, but it started from the Irish monks somehow, and they made it a private, the development. It was a later development in the church of private confessions. It wasn't, and it's amazing, if you study the Protestant reformers, almost all of them, unanimously, and one of the first things to do away with was private confession. Almost all of them attacked private confession. I'm not saying I agree with them or not agree with them, but that was not us. That is not us. That would definitely be listed as one of the lesser sacraments. That became preeminent, in the Roman Church, in the spirituality of the 40s and 30s. Especially after the Protestants attacked it. Trent really emphasized it. Trent was a reaction to the Protestant Reformation. And really, the Roman Church lived with that siege mentality all the way until Vatican II. Vatican II was the lifting of the siege mentality of Trent, the counter-reformation against the Protestants. And since the Protestants attacked confession, almost all of them unanimously attacked confession, except Luther. Luther still kind of kept confession. And he still kind of had a feel for it. He didn't do away with it as much as the other ones did. But almost all of the other Protestant reformers, almost unanimously, all of them did away with private confession. It should be only between you and... But that also dealt with spirituality, that the idea that the priest is the mediator between God and man. They did away with all that theology too. Everybody has the basis for the Lord's direction. But if I was, when I present that, I'll try to do more research on it. But it didn't come because of communion. That was not the connection originally. Later, that developed that spirituality, and that but not in the early church. So. Actually, penance was used for, and actually even chrismation in the Eastern tradition was used for not only to gain the Holy Spirit, but chrismation was also used for people who apostatized or became schismatics that left the church. And the Eastern tradition, one of the ways that chrismation was used after the rites of initiation was for those who went over to become Muslims, which is very common. Remember, you had the Ottoman occupation, 500 years of the Ottoman occupation. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, that was a very strong possibility of Orthodox or Eastern Christians becoming lapsy, of going over to Islam, and then they became sorry for that, and they wanted to come back, and one of the ways they were brought back into the church was by chrismation, not rebaptized. And that was another controversy in the early church. The Donatists said that this is a big controversy between Cyprian of Carthage and Pope Sylvester. The Donatists said that if you left the Christian faith, first of all, they said two things, that sacraments are only valid if the person administering the sacraments is not in a state of sin. If the priest is in a state of sin, the sacraments are not valid. Boy, that would be a tough one. Imagine over the centuries how many people have been validly baptized in 2,000 years. And secondly, they said that if you left the Christian faith, you could not come. You had to be rebaptized. If you became a lapsy, you went over to paganism or joined, actually rejected Christianity, you had to be rebaptized. And there was a strong controversy with Donatists and the Catholic position, which repudiated that. It said no, there's only one baptism. Once you're baptized, you're baptized. And secondly, that the sacraments are not dependent on the ministry. The efficaciousness of the sacrament does not depend on whether the priest is in sin or not. It's still an efficacious act if the will of the church is being done. And that also brings to another concept of the Byzantine tradition that says that only a baptized person can baptize. In emergencies, the Roman Catholics say that even a Jewish nurse can baptize a baby. If the nurse is baptizing with the spirit of the church, if she's baptizing in the intent of what the church would be doing if there was a priest there or a deacon or a baptized Catholic, it's valid. He says no, that for baptism to be valid, even in a state of emergency, where a layperson is doing the baptism, it has to be a baptized Christian. It's not valid if it's done by an unbaptized person. Yes. If you were baptized and chrismated as a baby and then you became a Muslim, you were brought back by chrismating. As a matter of fact, in Greece, they used to chrismate Catholics. In their periods of real anti-polemical Catholicism. It's the Russian Synod still in the United States. The one Russian branch, Russian Orthodox. If a Catholic joins the Russian Synod, I think they re-chrismate them. They don't re-baptize them, but they chrismate them. They consider it, they question Catholic confirmation. They would even probably question Catholic baptism. Go ahead, I'm sorry, you didn't say something else. And that's, no, I don't think the Catholic position would have a hard time with that. Although I don't know if that's since, I don't think that's ever been, that I really don't know for sure what the tradition has been in the Roman Rite. Did they ever use chrismation to, say someone leaves the Catholic Church and wants to come back. From everything that I know of, I don't think they ever use that as a means to, it's a profession of faith. They do a profession of faith. You come back that way. Not chrismation. Which kind of, in a way, when you rationalize it, though, it's almost like you're separating the two sacraments. almost like saying that there's well, that you're given a preeminence of baptism over confirmation, that baptism sort of has, and yet both of them have a different purpose. Confirmation is the acquisition of the Spirit, and baptism is the washing away of this fallen nature that we have, the original sin. In the fourth gospel of John, it's interesting that Jesus baptized. And we basically say that the basic theology of the church is that Jesus did baptize, and he was baptized by John the Baptist, and at that instant of the baptism there by John the Baptist, that this was really the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. But there's a place in John that kind of gives me the impression that Jesus did baptize. Does anybody have a Bible? In John 3, verses 22 to 23. The fourth gospel says at one point that Jesus himself was baptized, and at another that he did not baptize but authorized his disciples to do so. So there seems to be a contradiction. The basic theology of the church is that Jesus himself did not baptize, but by his baptism gave new significance to what baptism was all about. In the Jewish tradition, there was the Qumran community, the Essenes, they had a rite of baptism. So for Jews, baptism was basically a rite of purification. It was also a right to bring Gentiles. If a Gentile wanted to proselytize, if they were proselytized by the Jews and they wanted to become a Jew, they were accepted by baptism. And there was also, in John the Baptist's baptism and in the Jewish spirituality, baptism also had a strong connection with repentance. There were all kinds of, when John the Baptist was preaching in the desert, he was talking about, forgiveness of sins and repentance. You had to repent and forgiveness of sins. That was a strong Jewish theological concept. When Jesus would come along in the Christian baptism, they would have that also as a precondition for baptism, but there would be another whole aspect of baptism, the acquisition of the Holy Spirit. So Christian baptism would radically alter, would radically change the Jewish concept of baptism. There were three phases that the Jews had. They had the instructions of those who were wanting to become Jewish. And they had to study the law. They had to be circumcised. They had to study the commandments. Circumcision was also required of them. And then the application of the water itself. So there was those three phases for those who were converting from paganism over to Judaism. And that's one of the things that people don't know, that the Jews did a lot of proselytizing. There were a lot of people who became Jewish. Today, one of the things that we don't see Jews doing a whole lot of, especially here in America, for whatever reasons. Probably a lot of it connected with identity crisis and paranoia and the Holocaust and persecution and low profile, anti-Semitism. But in various phases of Judaism, there were periods where it was a proselytizing religion. The Khazars in Russia, in that one region in the steppes. If you go for the Black Sea, if you go around this one region where the Khazars are, they became Jewish. They converted to Judaism. And this was at the time of Christianity. They had a choice to become Jewish or Christian. John the Baptist regarded his baptism as a temporary rite, and he was, sort of waiting for the Messiah. He was waiting for someone that was going to initiate a whole new way of following the Spirit of the Lord and hearing the hours from God the Father. And so, his baptism was a repentance and forgiveness of sins, that Jesus would come along and give us a whole new dimension of baptism for the acquisition of the Spirit. Bring us into the body of Christ, into the family of Jesus, to a more closer union with God the Father. In the Eastern tradition, baptism is strongly associated with the idea of dying and being resurrected. There's the death and there's the resurrection. So for the water, when you immerse and you put into the water, there's this concept of Christ dying, and then the resurrection, the Easter, the Pascha, of rising new life, a new spirit, a new close relationship with God the Father. And that was closely brought out at Easter time. That's why when the catechumenists were baptized and brought into the church, they were brought in specifically at that Easter ritual. There was that connection with the resurrection, with death and new life, with death and the life.